You're listening to the Drive Home on 710 KURV. In all your holiday preparations, you probably didn't know, unless you're sort of in that loop, that the Texas foster children care system has been ruled unconstitutional, which is not something which has happened in a long time in Texas, where a function of the state is considered out of bounds by a federal judge. For good or for ill, right or wrong. The Texas Tribune article says Texas has violated the constitutional rights of foster children by exposing them to an unreasonable risk of harm in a system where children, quote, often age out of care more damaged than when they entered. Yeah. Years of abuse, neglect, and shuttling between inappropriate placements across the state has created a population that cannot contribute to society and proves a continued strain on the government through welfare, incarceration, or otherwise. U.S. District Judge Janice Jack of Corpus Christi wrote in a decision as strongly worded as it was hotly anticipated. Here to try to shed some light on this is Sarah Crockett. She is with an organization called Texas CASA, and CASA stands for Court Appointed Special Advocates. Thank you very much for being with us. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Davis. I'm happy to be here.
What does CASA do? What's its reason for being?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, it stands for Court-Appointed Special Advocates. And basically, we're appointed by the judge in a court hearing where when children are removed from their homes due to allegations of abuse or neglect, we're a volunteer-driven organization, and our volunteers from around the state receive around 30 to 40 hours of training prior to taking on their role. And they're appointed as guardian ad litem for the case, which means they represent the best interests of the child. And generally speaking, our volunteers represent either one child or one sibling group during the course of their case while they're in foster care. And so they really get to know the child in a way that many times the caseworkers and attorneys who have many more children that they're responsible for can and do.
So does the judges, maybe they quoted the only good parts in the 300 pages, but is it really as bad a system as the federal judge says from your all's experience?
Yeah, I definitely think that the judge did a great job of highlighting some of the systemic problems that we've seen really for decades as a state. And our volunteers serve only about 53% of the children and youth who are in foster care in Texas. And we primarily serve those kids who are in what's called temporary managing conservatorship, which means that the state of Texas is still working to reunify those children with their parents. And the class of kids who were the complainants in this case were actually primarily in permanent managing conservatorship, which are those kids that you sort of hear about growing up in foster care and things like that. And that means that the state has terminated the parental rights of those children's families. And they basically are eligible for adoption, but many of them don't have great placement options, and so end up bouncing from placement to placement and have some of the types of outcomes that were highlighted in this ruling.
It's 4:44. We're talking with Sarah Crockett. She's a public policy coordinator for CASA in Texas. We're talking about the federal court decision which ruled unconstitutional the Texas foster children care system.
Hi, Sarah. It's Roxanne. How many children are in foster care here in Texas?
So at any given time in Texas, and kids kind of come in and out of care, but there's about 12,000 children who are in the TMC, which is the temporary managing conservatorship that I was talking about, and around 10,000 or so that are in PMC. And that number, again, fluctuates from different points in time, but that's about the average on any given day.
So let me back up. So the temporary stuff is kids who are is it the kids who are salvageable, or is it their families who are salvageable?
So it's the families. So
Okay.
generally speaking, when children are removed from their families, the state does everything that they can to try and help support parents to, get out of domestic violence relationships or address substance abuse challenges, or really any of the reasons that could have led to the abuse and neglect that happened in the first place. And there are some cases where we aren't able to kind of repair that situation. And so after 1 year or a year and a half is the general time frame. If the parents aren't able to sort of fix the problems that they had, then the state will terminate their parental rights and take permanent managing conservatorship of those children.
Which is the system now. That's the phase or the sector or section that we're talking about. The judge says is just no good. So what are, where you can be graphic as you want, but can you explain to people what it is that's wrong, or what the judge found to be wrong, and what CASA thinks is wrong about the permanent managing conservatorship portion of this?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of really complex challenges that kind of really collide in making the system as kind of detrimental as it has been for such a long time. I think one of the biggest challenges is that in Texas, the caseworkers who work for the Department of Family and Protective Services actually have 2 to 4 times the nationally recommended number of children on their cases, which means they have very little time to get to know kids and to really ensure that their well-being is being met. So I think that's one of the big challenges, and certainly one of the issues that was raised in this case. And then just really a lack of sufficient placements for these kids. And many times children who are in permanent managing conservatorship no longer have an attorney, which they're entitled to when they're in TMC. And then they also often don't have a CASA volunteer either.
So they're sort of on their own, or they're younger than 18, because at 18 they're adults and can get out of the system?
Exactly right, yeah. So they don't have a lot of folks looking out for them, and they end up being in these placements that often are unsafe and are hard to monitor.
Earlier you talked about what's in the best interest for the child. Well, how do you guys determine what that is?
So that's a great question. I think our volunteers consider a lot of things. So the caseworker represents the state in the case, and the attorney ad litem generally represents what the children want, which is sometimes in their best interest and sometimes isn't. And the CASA volunteer or the guardian ad litem really kind of takes into consideration everything. And they know generally the parents, the child's parents, they know the child really well. They're very familiar with how everything is going with the school. So they have a really kind of robust picture of the child and what the individual child needs in terms of therapy, in terms of the type of placement. Like maybe a child really would benefit from having some older children in the home that could kind of mentor them or things like that. And so when you really know a kid, you know what they need, and you know sort of what their history is and what, might trigger them in terms of trauma or things like that. And so you really can kind of fight and advocate for them to have the type of placement and the type of services that are going to be the best fit for each child.
How does a child get placed into foster care? Because I always thought that, their parents passed away and they have no family, no extended family, but sometimes it's more than that.
Right. So we often work in CASA to find other family members who are willing or able to take them. But the federal government sort of has laid out some guidelines that say, if a child is removed due to abuse and neglect by their parent, we can't just wait forever to find them a permanent option. So that's why I was mentioning the year to year and a half timeline for the parents to really kind of get it together. And then the feds really say at that point, then we need to figure out another plan if parents can't,
They've been putting them in
whatever's
foster
going on
homes, right, or
now.
group homes for kids who can't find a placement. But apparently the judge says that's just a nest of troubles, and she will not allow it.
Yeah, so one of the challenges that we find for kids who end up being in permanent managing conservatorship is there aren't actually very many foster homes. So those are like where you have, one or two parents and they have, 0 to 6 kids in their home, and it's more like a family. And so what happens is kids end up being placed in what are called group homes, which have many more children, or they're placed in these really large organizations, basically, that could have, there's one in Texas that has 437 children currently.
Under one roof?
Yeah, it's really like a big kind of compound, but yes, exactly. So there's a lot of different options for kids. So I think when we think of foster care, you think of that foster home that's like a foster family, but many times kids are in much bigger facilities that are really staffed by professionals who have shift changes and things like that. And so it's not,
it's not a home. It's not a home as we think of it. It's just a place to put the kid.
It's not a family, exactly.
Last question, because I think we're running out of time. Does anybody have a cost on a dollar figure what it will cost to fix the problem? For example, and I'm sure there's only one thing, if the Child Protective Services caseworkers, the people who respond to reports of bad circumstance for the kids, if they have 2 to 4 times the national caseload, then there's an argument to be made to double or quadruple the workforce to bring it down to a national average. Well, that's a lot of people and a big cost. So what's all this going to cost to fix it if money is going to be appropriated?
Yeah, so I think money is important, and it is important for folks in Texas to know that the child welfare system is definitely underfunded. But the other challenge is that there's a huge amount of turnover at the department, and that creates a lot of staffing shortages. So I've seen figures of up to 25 to 30% of staffing slots for those caseworkers are actually just not, they're not manned.
Wow.
And so those figures for caseloads, if we could get 100% staffing across the state and have that be consistent, the caseloads would go down drastically. What happens is that we spend a long time training caseworkers, and then, after a year or two, they leave. And then other folks have to take on those children that were on that caseload.
Sarah Crockett, thank you for your time.
Yes,
we appreciate it, and we will check back with you.
Thank you so much.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am. Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas to you. Sarah Crockett is Public Policy Coordinator for CASA, which is Children Court-Appointed Special Advocates, talking about the Texas juvenile, what would you call it, children foster care system in Texas being no good, according to the federal judge. You're listening to The Drive Home on 710 KURV.